Everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our webinar, Ripple Effects, Why Textiles Need to Get Serious About Water Risk. I am Richard Wielechowski, Senior Analyst on the Textiles Programme at Planet Tracker. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sharma Paveen from Ceres for today's event. Now, just to discuss the agenda and a few housekeeping items, I'm going to kick off by discussing some of the Planet Tracker's recent work on water and textiles and why we believe it is a business risk for the industry, which should be on investors' radar. Sharma will then take over to discuss apparel-related findings from the Ceres Valuing Water Finance Initiative. And we'll finish off with an opportunity to answer any questions you may have. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either email me at the address shown on the slide, that's richard@planet-tracker.org, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. That's the Q&A function, not the chat. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you via email after the event. So finally, just before I kick off, please note this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the event by Planet Tracker. So just before I get into the meat of the webinar, maybe a brief introduction to Planet Tracker for those who don't know us. Planet Tracker is a non-profit sustainable finance think tank. Our goal is via our research and engagement to highlight the importance of nature-related risk and opportunities to capital markets and help them move to including sustainability in their investment decisions. Now, within the textiles program, our work focuses on the financial materiality of three overarching themes. Firstly, encouraging greater traceability and transparency in the supply chain. Secondly, highlighting the environmental degradation from current business practices and how and where investment can make a difference. And thirdly, emphasizing the risks of business as usual to corporates and their investors. With that, I will move on to the actual meat of the webinar and discuss our recent work that's examined the way water can be a business risk for the apparel industry. All our research and analytics is available on our website, which is planet-tracker.org, and we're always happy to discuss our work in greater detail if helpful. I'd also like to take the chance to thank the Global Commons Alliance Accountability Accelerator, who funded the recent work that we've done on water. So, stepping back, why are we talking about water today? Well, water is a critical input for a number of steps in the manufacture of apparel. Additionally, the process of apparel manufacture can also materially impact local water quality and availability. On this slide, we show different tiers of the supply chain and note some of the ways that they are dependent on water and some of the ways they impact water. Most notably, water is both a key input and most impacted by some of the earliest stages of the production process, here shown as tiers 3 and 4. Tier 4, the production of raw materials, includes the use of water in growing fibers, for instance. As an example, data from the International Cotton Advisory Committee suggests a kilo of cotton lint consumes about 8,000 litres of water as it's grown. Many key cotton growing areas rely on irrigating fields, meaning a lack of water could directly impact yields. On the other hand, agriculture can also negatively impact water supply quality and availability. This could be due to overconsumption. It could be due to pollution due to runoff of pesticides or fertilizers. The case study of the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan is a great example of the way agriculture can dramatically impact water supplies. Diversions of tributaries to provide irrigation for cotton cultivation has led to the water level in the sea dropping by 23 meters and led to desertification of the surrounding area. The fiber production step of apparel manufacture is also noteworthy for its reliance on water and its potential negative impacts. The wet processing of fibers, which can include scouring, bleaching, and finishing, typically involves significant water use. The water involved is often polluted with toxic chemicals as part of the process, representing a threat to local water supplies if this mixture is then released back into the environment without proper management. So, having discussed a couple of ways in which water is fundamental to textile production, we note that this reliance makes water a potential threat to the supply chain. Lack of access to water could impact yields or production volumes. It's also worth noting that in a world of climate change and increasingly severe weather, flooding and sea level rise can also potentially threaten farms and factories. With the majority of capital in the industry sitting at the retail stage of the supply chain, in general, financiers would seem to be sheltered from much of this direct risk from rising water risk. However, the big apparel brands obviously rely on the continued functioning of their supply chains to produce product, and thus water-related disruption could materially impact sales. Now, moving on, in our report exposing water risk, we examined how 29 of the biggest apparel brands are discussing and talking about the potential of water as a risk to their businesses. In order to assess how executive management at major apparel brands perceive this risk to their businesses, we used a set of keywords related to water risk, for instance, pollution or volume. These keywords relate to how companies communicate various aspects of water-related risk to their investors and other stakeholders. The keywords we used can be grouped into 4 broad buckets: consumption-related, pollution-related, risk-related, and other. And we analysed nearly 3,950 documents and transcripts using our proprietary natural language processing algorithm to determine where the word water, one of these context words, was mentioned. The documents analysed include reports such as annual reports, CSR and ESG reports, quarterly reports and transcripts from company presentations, earnings calls, and shareholder meetings. In total, of the documents we analysed, only 10% included water risk-related disclosures. Now, this might seem quite a high level. However, we found significant variation in the level of discussion of water risk, with some brands mentioning it quite often, for instance, Kering, LVMH, or The Gap, whilst others seem to barely mention it at all, for instance, Under Armour or Victoria's Secret. We looked at disclosures from 2018 to 2022, and encouragingly, the total mentions of water-related risk have risen across the analysed period, from around 2,000 disclosures in 2018 to now 9,000 in 2022. This suggests that those who are talking about water are talking about it more and more often. Looking across the brands in our sample, most mentions of water-related risk are found in either sustainability reports or annual reports. There was very little mention of water in transcripts from corporate events, suggesting it's not something that investors are asking about in these fora. So why aren't investors asking about water risk? Should they care about apparel's dependency on water or the industry's impact on water? To emphasize why we think investors should care about water, our latest report, Ripple Effects, looked at the location of apparel manufacture and the level of water stress today and in the future. Climate change or population growth is expected to alter water dynamics across the globe over the next 30 years. Specifically, data from the WRI aqueduct shows how water stress is expected to increase in many areas of the world by 2050. The chart on this slide, it shows in deeper red areas of more significant water stress. We can immediately see high levels of expected water stress in a number of regions associated with apparel manufacture, such as Turkey or India. To us, this data emphasizes that water is likely to be a growing risk for many parts of the apparel supply chain over time. But how would that risk manifest itself? On this slide, we discuss the 3 high-level ways we think this water-related risk could manifest for individual apparel companies. Firstly, there is the physical risk related to the quality and quantity of water available. This physical risk is most likely to impact down in the supply chain for apparel. As discussed previously, a lack of water for irrigation could impact cotton yields in many areas, or a lack of clean water could compromise production in, for instance, the wet processing step. Secondly, there's regulatory risk. Access to clean water is a key human right and a key human need. Increasing water stress could see increasing competition for water. This raises the risk of regulation of water access, price rises, and a risk to social license to operate for businesses that are consuming water in large quantities or polluting local water supplies. This social angle to water also impacts onto the third type of risk we see, which is reputational risk, where brands could see a negative impact if associated with negative environmental or social impacts due to their water use. We've seen in the past stock prices react negatively to allegations of slave labor in supply chains. Association with the pollution of local water supplies and the associated human health impacts could represent another risk to brand equity in the future. We know that the lack of access to safe water sources is a leading risk factor for a number of infectious diseases. And although, of course, there are many reasons beyond apparel manufacture why clean water may not be available, sustainability-minded investors should be considering how their investments impact local water availability and how that flows through into human health impacts. On this slide, we summarize some of the ways that these risks could actually impact the P&L for corporates. Firstly, a lack of water availability in the supply chain could see production volumes limited. This would mean a lack of stock for retailers, reducing supplies. So, for instance, if wet processors can't get enough water to produce the product, they can't send it on to the retailer for sale. We could also see the cost of production rise as manufacturers have to pay more for water, or they have to invest into water-saving technology. Assuming this cost is passed on to retailers, it will then be passed on presumably to consumers, difficult often in a very tightly and highly competitive market. Water could also impact insurance and logistics costs. For instance, flooding risk could rise, or shipment routes could be impacted by droughts or flooding. We know that a small increase in costs can drive a relatively big change in earnings. A brand operating with a typical 55% gross margin and 15% EBIT margin would see around a 3% fall in operating profit from just a 1% increase in its cost of goods sold. Now, given the importance of water to the industry and the potential business impacts on water-related disruption, we'd expect it to be a key point of concern for corporates across the value chain and their finances. So having discussed how water is a critical input for apparel and how it could impact business operations, where are the crunch points most likely to be? Where and what brands and manufacturers are most at risk? Alongside our ripple effects note, we've produced an interactive dashboard to help investors and financiers think about where the crunch points on water stress may be and how different corporates are exposed. Using data from WRI Aqueduct and Open Supply Hub, we've mapped apparel factory location across the globe against water stress today and in the future. The dashboard allows users to visualize factory location based on the different brands that the factory is supplying, by the size of the brand supplied, or by the location of incorporation of the brand supplied. Based on the selection made, users are able to then identify the location of the apparel facility and determine the intensity of the current and forecasted water stress that facility is exposed to. I encourage you to head to our website and use the dashboard if you're interested in the analysis. Please also reach out to us if you have any questions. So, summing up the outputs from our analysis, water stress is today already significant in many supplying regions. Projected changes in water stress for many regions suggest that competition for water for industrial use and the need for sanitation and drinking water supplies could pose a growing problem both from a regulatory point of view and also as brands attempt to promote their sustainability credentials. Most brands appear to be impacted according to our analysis. And interestingly, we found that North American incorporated brands seem to face the biggest increase in their supply chain water stress through 2050 compared to those based in Europe or Asia Pacific. Now, given the likely growing challenge from water stress, we believe brands should be proactive in the way they are investing to address this risk. We emphasize that some of our previous analysis has suggested that relatively small investments at the appropriate supply chain stage can drive potentially significant water savings while also displaying a positive financial return. Our report, Easy Unpickings, in collaboration with the Apparel Impact Institute, showed that across a sample of 67 wet processing facilities, investment of only $455,000 could help drive an annual water saving of 11.5% alongside benefits of other environmental benefits and with a payback period of only 14 months. We see this as evidence that brands should be acting in concert with their suppliers to make these sort of sustainability investments and to reduce the risk on a number of different measures, including water. So, to summarize all the key takeaways from what I've discussed today, we believe water could be a material business risk to the textile industry. We also acknowledge the significant social impacts of water availability and note the risks to brand sustainability efforts from this angle. Given these potential impacts and risks, we believe investors and financiers should make sure water risk is included in their investment decisions in the space. They should ensure that they are discussing water with corporate management and challenge them on how they assess and manage water dependencies and impacts. Investors should push for transparent apples-to-apples reporting of water dependency and water impacts across corporates using a standardized framework. Finally, they should support corporates to create a comprehensive strategy to address their water use and negative impacts, ensure this is backed with appropriate capex, and ensure that management teams are incentivized to deliver on this plan over time. With that, I'm delighted to hand over to Shama to discuss the work Ceres has been doing in this area. Over to you, Shama.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. I'm Shama Parveen, Director of Research on the Water team at Ceres, and I'm glad to be here with you all today. I'll be sharing some updates from the recently launched Valuing Water Finance initiative. It focuses on engaging some large companies on water, including those in the apparel sector. And central to our engagements is a benchmark assessment that we conduct to understand how some of the largest companies are addressing water risks in their value chain. And today I'll provide some key highlights from the apparel industry analyses. Next slide, please. So as some of you may already know, Ceres is a nonprofit working with a large network of investors, companies, and other nonprofit organizations in the space. So we drive action through them on sustainability issues. Here on this milestone, you'll see some of our notable achievements with regard to a programmatic focus on water. As you can see, we have been honing in on the business and scientific case for action as we continue to see water risks playing out in real time. And so through our various partnerships, our thought leadership and research, we continue to drive investor and corporate action on water. Next, please. So a couple of years ago, we released a report in collaboration with the University of Saskatchewan called Global Assessment of Private Sector Impacts on Fresh Water, and the report is linked here. It was to fill an important gap in research and to ensure investor action on water risk is grounded in the scientific case for action. So similar to the research from Planet Tracker highlighting the material risks of water to the textile industry, this research also demonstrated the business risks posed by water to the industry. The global assessment report showed that the apparel sector is highly water intensive and extremely polluting to freshwater resources throughout its value chain. And as you can see here, it was identified as one of the sectors most responsible for undermining the functionality of global freshwater systems. Next slide, please. At a more granular level, as Richard laid out through his slide 2, this report also illustrated a relative assessment of water impacts caused by the industry within specific areas of the value chain, whether it's direct operations, supply chains, or end product use. As highlighted in the report, textiles, apparel, and luxury goods were identified as high risk for water quantity and quality impacts in the supply chain. In direct operations, water quantity showed up as medium risk, although water quality was still very high. Additionally, at the product use and end of life, the sector poses significant high water risk quality impacts. And for those interested in a deeper dive, as I mentioned, the full report is linked here. It has 70 years worth of research as to what kind of impacts all of the industry sectors have on freshwater and vice versa. Next, please. So recognizing the significant water challenges, Ceres collaborates with investors and companies to address the critical sustainability issues. By making smart water management a core business practice, Ceres drives private sector action to tackle some of these growing challenges like increasing demands, wasteful use, and pollution. On the slide here, you'll see some of the apparel companies on our BICEP company network and on our Value Water Finance Initiative focus list. Next. So in order to make the risk more tangible and to bolster the business case for action on water, we've developed 2 financial materiality briefs focusing on the value at risk from water externalities in the packaged meat and apparel sectors. This research was conducted in partnership with DWS, S&P Global, and Blue Risk, and it was the first of its kind corporate valuation methodology that used the true cost of water waste and the pollution impact of companies. As you can see here, the analysis for some of the apparel companies found that the cost of addressing the harmful water impacts could lead to a change in company valuation of up to negative 47%. And the costs could be nearly $1.8 billion annually for some of the firms that we analyzed. But we all know that the cost of inaction could be several times more. The briefs clearly show the double materiality that investors are facing in regard to water risks, and it also showed that there is sufficient information to estimate the magnitude of the water-related externalities. It has a replicable methodology that investors can consider using to encourage companies to estimate their impacts and capitalize on opportunities. Next slide, please. Last year, we also partnered with Blue Risk to build off of this work to include the potential benefits of acting on water risks. So, while companies have been using a variety of ways to quantify the financial value of water for their businesses, these approaches have typically focused on risks or the cost of damages. So, in response to the interest that we kept receiving from financial institutions, investors, and companies, this brief introduces a framework that helps to estimate both the cost as well as benefits of engaging in water stewardship. So it allows companies and investors to gain a more complete financial picture or to better understand the full value of water and to prioritize action where it matters the most. So, companies and investors can not only strengthen the business case for action, but also identify how their investments and where their investments can have the greatest impact. For example, as you see here, through the cost sharing approach, the research shows that collective action in partnership with other stakeholders in the basin, it provides a better business and societal return on investments. Next, please. So, with all the scientific and research conducted and the research base in hand, we launched the Valuing Water Finance initiative almost 2 years ago now to help companies address their urgent water related risks and to reduce their water footprint. As you see here, the vision of the initiative is that companies will recognize fresh water as the world's most precious natural resource essential to whole industries and all communities and ecosystems. Investors have consistently emphasized to us the fiduciary duty of acting on water risk. And since the launch, the initiative is now supported by more than 100 investor signatories who are now actively engaging with the companies on our focus list. Next slide, please. So the guiding framework or the North Star of the initiative is a set of 6 corporate expectations for valuing water that you see here. We developed these with investors, NGOs, scientific advisors, and other stakeholders working in the water stewardship space. And as you see, these expectations cover a suite of water-related issues from quantity, quality, ecosystem to public policy. And the benchmark that I'll be sharing more information about seeks to understand where a company is on its journey to meet the 2030 ambitions of these expectations. These expectations, as you can see, are all ambitious, but they are there to account for the reality around us. We see the CSRD in Europe, for instance, raising the bar for companies, requiring comprehensive value chain reporting and a double materiality lens. We see SBTN including water quality, biodiversity, and land metrics. And of course, the climate-induced water crisis continues to intensify. So by incorporating these expectations, organizations can contribute to building climate and water resilience, not only within their operations, but within the broader communities and ecosystems they impact. Next. So the Valuing Water initiative reached an important milestone in October last year when we launched our inaugural benchmark analysis and the report. So the objective of the benchmark really was fourfold. One of the central aims was for us to evaluate how 72 companies, including some apparel companies, were aligning with the 2030 ambition of the expectations. We also wanted to spotlight some leading practices adopted by companies. The benchmark data and the evaluations also serves as a tool for the ongoing investor engagements by offering data into where corporate initiatives are excelling or falling short. And finally, through the benchmark, we will continue to monitor and document company progress over time. We plan to conduct the assessment every 2 years, and the next assessment will be released in late 2025. Next, please. So in short, for the methodology itself, we have 2 core indicators under each expectation, and each of those have sub-indicators with increasing point allocation. So if you look at our methodology, the increasing score reflects increasing scope and ambition of corporate water stewardship. For example, companies having no targets for water use reduction or limited evidence or on the lower ambition versus those having more ambitious targets for water use, especially considering high water risk priority sites, suppliers, or commodities. We also have some advanced indicators based on leading practices that companies are addressing, like including pollutants of concern, disclosing contextual impacts, or even participating in collective action efforts within the basin. The benchmark currently assesses 72 companies from food, beverage, apparel, and high tech industries. But I would also like to note here that this benchmark is not a new disclosure framework or a reporting system. We don't solicit information from companies. We partner with a third party consultant to evaluate available company disclosures and data to assess how companies are performing and where gaps exist to help make the case for investor and corporate action in those areas. Next, please. So based on the overall assessment of the 72 companies across the 2030 ambition of the expectations that you saw in the earlier slide, we developed this ambition spectrum, and you can find this in the benchmark report that we launched in October last year. So we basically took the overall percentage score that a company received and placed it within one of the 4 categories that you see here: starting the journey, on the way, on track, and leading the way. For companies who are starting the journey, they're meeting less than 35% of the 2030 corporate expectation ambition, and therefore still in the preliminary stages. And we do find that a majority of the companies fell into this category. And as you progress up the ambition spectrum to on the way or to on track, this signifies a company is becoming more aligned with the 2030 ambition. We did not see any companies currently leading the way. However, we do see almost a dozen companies on track, and that was encouraging to see that they were making substantial progress towards the 2030 ambition. Next, please. This slide offers a view of how the apparel companies were faring across the 6 expectations. Overall, as you see, apparel companies performed better on the board oversight expectation, where we assessed them on several criteria, including board oversight of water issues and integration of water risks into decision making. The assessment also reveals concerning gaps in the access to water and sanitation expectation, where companies showed notable shortcomings into how they were addressing wash within their value chain. Similarly, public policy engagement appeared as another area of concern, with companies demonstrating limited advocacy and lobbying efforts in shaping water-related public policies. Next slide, please. And this slide here, it presents a comparative analysis of individual company performance within the apparel industry. Among the 11 companies that we assessed, the industry's average score stood at 30.1 out of a possible 90 points, indicating there's considerable room for improvement in water-related initiatives across the sector for some of the largest companies that we see here. Gap was the company that was classified on track, indicating that they're making progress in addressing water-related challenges and starting to align with the 2030 ambition. The bottom 3 performers were categorized as starting the journey, included VF Corp, Burberry, and Lululemon, highlighting the need to increase their efforts to improve their water management strategies. In short, we see varying degrees of commitment and progress among the apparel companies in addressing water sustainability. Next, please. So in terms of the apparel companies on the ambition spectrum itself, we find that 6 are still starting the journey, signifying that they are in the initial stages of addressing water-related challenges. And so therefore, there's significant room for improvement across the board. 4 are on the way, meeting less than 50%, but they still have been making substantial improvements in integrating sustainability into their corporate strategies. And 1 company, as I mentioned, is on track, demonstrating efforts in advancing sustainability initiatives. Next, please. So in terms of target to reduce water use, we found that 8 out of 11 companies that we analyzed have set some kind of targets to address water availability. When I say some kind, it's either in the direct operations or supply chain. We only see 3 companies have established contextual targets, including a consideration of high-risk basins. For instance, GAP has committed to achieving net positive water impact in water-stressed regions, and they have interim goals to reduce water use and replenish water equivalent to the volume of water used in their manufacturing facilities. In terms of water quality, we see 7 companies have established some kind of water quality related targets, but only 2 companies, H&M and Gap, have set contextual targets in high water stress areas. H&M, for example, they aim to ensure that by 2030, all of the wastewater within its supply chain will be treated to avoid any adverse effects on the receiving water bodies. Next slide, please. Among the 4 industries that we assess, the apparel sector, in fact, stands out for its widespread adoption of sustainable sourcing commitments, policies, and supplier engagements to mitigate negative impacts on ecosystems. Some companies were leveraging external certifications such as the Leather Working Group, Global Organic Textile Standard, Responsible Down Standard, Better Cotton, and stuff. For example, Lululemon has a target to achieve a minimum of 75% sustainably sourced materials for its products by 2025, and they have set several underlying targets to reach their overall commitments. Some apparel companies that we saw, they were also trying to navigate traceability challenges with regard to raw materials procurement. However, none of the apparel companies that we analyzed had set targets aimed at protecting or restoring ecosystems critical to freshwater supplies. Next, please. We also assessed apparel company actions with regard to ensuring access to water and sanitation within their value chain, and we found only 3 apparel companies, Kering, Gap, and VF Corp, acknowledge human right to water and sanitation within their corporate policy, and only 3 companies having set time-bound wash targets for their suppliers and the communities they operate in. Next slide, please. So we also pulled out key industry notable highlights and areas for improvement, and detailed insights are available in the apparel industry report that's linked here. In terms of positive highlights, we saw that apparel companies are actively engaging with assembly and manufacturing suppliers to track and report water data, including their withdrawals, consumptions, and risks. And they're using platforms like Higg Facility Environmental Module to customize strategies within their supply chain. Many apparel companies we analyzed are also focusing on reducing their impacts on water quality, working towards zero discharge of hazardous chemicals, and several were also participating in collaborative efforts with various industry groups such as the Textile Exchange, Fashion Pact, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Better Cotton, ZDHC, and stuff. These partnerships are fostering the establishment of best practices and guidelines, including Clean by Design program, US Cotton Trust Protocol, Higgs Material Sustainability Index, etc. In terms of the areas identified for improvement, we saw that while companies are in general recognizing the water intensive nature of raw materials, and some have included raw material suppliers into their sustainable sourcing strategies, very few are including them in their water quantity and quality related targets. And this omission actually overlooks a significant portion of the water footprint within the value chain. And as I explained earlier, none of the apparel companies had set time-bound ecosystem conservation restoration targets critical to freshwater supplies, and they had gaps in commitment to ensuring access to water, sanitation, and hygiene as well. Next slide, please. So lastly, this graphic will help to visualize how the different pieces within the initiative fit together. We have the publicly available company disclosures. As you see on the left, they serve as the foundational data for the benchmark assessment that we conduct, and it provides detailed insights into the corporate water stewardship practices. And the assessments that we do find informs investor engagements with companies under the initiative, and that serves as a catalyst for dialogue and action, encouraging companies to set higher ambitions and strive for better results in water sustainability. This process also creates a feedback loop where this exchange of information between companies and investors, it also enables both parties to continuously improve and align with industry standards and practices. And by staying attuned to evolving standards and practices, companies can also enhance their own corporate practices and adapt to meeting industry expectations effectively. So with that, I'll stop here and pass it back to Richard. Happy to answer questions during the Q&A.
Thank you, Shara. With that, I will stop sharing and we'll move, as I say, to the Q&A section. As mentioned earlier, please feel free to email me any questions at richard@planet-tracker.org or use that Q&A function in Zoom. I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question, seeing as I'm on the Zoom here, and say I was interested in the benchmark findings that you've got there. But how does apparel appear relative to other sectors that you've looked at?
Thank you for the question, Richard. Our benchmark, as I mentioned, highlights trends across four industries: food, beverage, apparel, and high tech. For the apparel companies that we assessed, we found that they were overall doing relatively better on board oversight expectation. For instance, several companies were briefing their boards regularly on water risks and considering water risks and opportunities, integrating them into business strategies. We also found several apparel companies were assessing water quality risks and setting quality targets to align with the zero discharge of hazardous chemicals. And some companies include Burberry, LVMH, Adidas, and VF Core. But similar to other industries, a lot of apparel companies are still in the preliminary stages of starting the journey, which means significant work across the board is needed, and they are altogether failing to consider local watershed conditions while establishing their quantity quality related targets. And as your research also assessed, they still need to put more focus on providing access to water and sanitation, because this, along with other water quantity and contextual lack of contextual targets, puts the sector itself at risk. Lastly, they need to participate in public policy advocacy to influence public policy decisions and processes. Our benchmark report that we published, we have flagged about 12 key areas where significant work across the board is needed. So if folks are interested, they could take a look at that. Additionally, we have several industry-specific reports with leading practices, strengths, and gaps that can also be of interest.
Thank you. Now, we've had a couple of questions coming on the Q&A function, so I'll move to one of those. Shama, what resources and methods of measurement do you recommend for apparel companies to set targets around aquatic biodiversity? You mentioned that as one of the weak points. So what can they be doing?
So when we talk about aquatic biodiversity, we are actually trying to hone in on the integrated aspect of all of the expectations. So when they are doing their assessments with regard to water quantity risk assessments, they need to be including some water quality risks, access to water and sanitation risks. Like we have tremendous amount of data available from WRI Aqueduct and WWF Risk Filter that can help hone in on some of those and include some key areas, biodiversity hotspots, both the risk tools and filters that I mentioned. They have those kind of data sets available. And finally, I feel even after getting into those global data sets, companies need to do local level analyses. And this is where I'm saying contextual analyses are actually missing. They need to integrate, if companies are reporting to TNFD, if companies are including doing nature assessments, try and look at it holistically instead of looking at it in terms of silos.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think there's another question from the Q&A, which I think is very pertinent, and we certainly struggle with sometimes at Planet Tracker is there a way to assess the robustness of the targets set? I mean, the questioner asks if one culprit is effectively setting a target to become net water positive, is it unreasonable versus what H&M are doing? How do we tell when a corporate is setting easy targets it's going to meet almost without trying, and those who are really pushing themselves and making a substantial difference?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We actually explored quite a bit of that within the benchmark report itself. Like, how do you compare or analyze various different targets? There could be one company setting targets across the enterprise, but then it could be very ambitious by itself and could mean a lot of work vis-a-vis other companies who could be taking one or two priority regions and setting targets based on that. But in general, and looking across, we found that companies who are actually using the results from their risk assessments and developing priority sites, priority suppliers, mapping that, and then coming into priority commodities, so having a stepwise process, trying to see which commodities they're going to be focusing in first, which suppliers they're going to be focusing in first, overlaying it with the risk assessment results, and then trying to develop targets focusing in on high stress regions. And NPWI, net positive water impact from, WRC is, provides some guidance on that as to how the three parameters of quantity, quality, and access could be included. And a lot of companies are doing that. But I don't think there is an easy answer to saying a net positive water impact per se is better than a company having a water replenishment or a water restoration. Sometimes we did see in our analyses that although a company is going ahead and saying net positive water impact, and another company is doing water balance or water restoration, it was almost comparative as to what they were doing. So if companies are including their operations and supply chains, including them in the targets, and honing in on contextual targets, including high risk regions, then I feel like they're doing their bit in addressing the impacts.
So from an investor point of view, you're looking for targets that are detailed, with a lot of research behind them, focused on high risk basins or high use basins as a sort of way of assessing those who are taking on a real challenge.
Yes.
Great. One question for me has come in. Can I share a bit more about this specific North America brands water risk? Well, the data is all in our dashboard. I really encourage you to go to the website to use that. It's a little hard to talk to without being able to sort of play around with that and show you the different pieces. But there you can really see there's a difference in terms of sometimes in terms of the geographic footprint we're comparing across these regions in terms of their sort of sourcing regions that they're most reliant on. That's a factor in driving the delta in water risk, and it allows you also to dive into within those North America brands which ones have got the greater risk versus their peers. So happy to follow that up afterwards if you have more questions on that and walk through the dashboard if that would be helpful. But I'll leave it there, as I say, without being able to sort of pull up the dashboard and play around with it. But I've just got a question coming on email as well. It's for you, Shama, around the Valuing Water initiative. The question is, it's investor led. How are companies leveraging the benchmarks you're doing? How is it being, used by the apparel industry or more broadly?
Yeah, we have been meeting. That's a very good question. We have been meeting quite a few companies since the launch of the report, and we've heard from them that they greatly appreciate external benchmarks like these because it helps them understand how their work situates them amongst their peers and where the particular strengths and opportunities for improvement lie. We've also heard from companies that the examples of leading company practices within their respective sectors have been useful for overcoming similar water challenges. Um, Companies are also learning from best management practices outside of their sectors, and some leading companies are actually diving into, if they're from a food company, they're diving into the beverage sector report or apparel sector report to come up with new water stewardship tactics. Some companies are telling us that they're planning to use the benchmark results in internal meetings when they have strategy review meetings. Others are aligning with the methodology itself to as they're updating their targets and establishing a longer term water stewardship strategy by referring to the expectations and the benchmark as a framework. And lastly, companies are also sharing that it may help to drive them to highlight additional details in their public disclosures, because sometimes companies are doing stuff, but they are not able to disclose as well. For instance, they're not able to disclose more details on their risk assessment process. The robustness of it comes through in their disclosures, like how they're choosing their priority sites, suppliers, and commodities. How some of their regional projects are helping them meet targets for wash and perhaps ecosystem protection with fresh water in consideration, and how some collaborative efforts are leading to holistic outcomes in watersheds. So companies are doing that, but we are hoping that this leads to better, for them to disclose better.
I'm interested you mentioned collaboration there, because I think, particularly in the water area, this is something that's a real challenge. I mean, a basin is not going to be, the impacts on a basin is unlikely to be down to one corporate's actions. It's going to be a story of many actors, all with influences. So how important is company collaboration going to be in addressing shared water challenges in a basin?
Well, you and I both know that a lot of the movement, current movement, is around collective action efforts now, simply because no company is operating in isolation within a watershed. Engaging in collective action at the watershed level helps companies to scale the positive impact of whatever they're trying to achieve, and signifies their commitment to holistic management of water as a shared resource. Because ultimately, if a company is working in a basin, doing having the absolute best water targets, but then the impacts are not being seen at the basin level, then they're still at risk, right? So through our benchmark, we found that companies are reporting partnership with other stakeholders, including other nonprofits, even local farmers, universities, and other industry-led projects, and restoring watersheds through nature-based solutions, or improving agricultural practices, or supporting water replenishment and balancing projects. However, one thing I would like to note here, that despite several promising examples of collective action efforts, we need to see more attention being paid to ensure long-term positive outcomes in high-risk watersheds. So instead of participating in one-off projects, companies should be engaging in meaningful collective action efforts that supports their own progress towards their commitments. So moving forward, we would like to see companies engaged in collective action to also improve their reporting, because as I said, sometimes there is a gap between what they're doing and what they're reporting. So they should, if they're doing a detailed reporting of the progress and outcomes of their collective action efforts, then that not only leads to other companies working within the basin to look up to them, but it also makes it clear to the stakeholders that what kind of transformative impact has transpired within the watershed.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'm going to have one final question to wrap up, and I always like to try and finish on a positive note. So you've got the valuing water ambitions to 2030. What makes you excited, hopeful about what can move the dial as we approach 2030?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question to finish on. The encouraging company examples give us hope, like companies like Gap setting targets and goals for becoming water positive by 2030. And I'm just mentioning a splatter of companies. There could be a lot more. These are just some from what we analyze that comes to mind. So companies having ambitious targets to mitigate water risks and improve their water stewardship. Several apparel companies we analyze, like Burberry, Adidas, and VF are working to reduce chemicals being released into waterways by adopting the ZDHC guidelines and manufacturing restricted substances list for part or all of their suppliers, which is actually amazing. Companies like LVMH adopting sustainability governance practices for their corporate boards. All of these encouraging examples give us hope. And to move the dial in the coming years, we'd like to see much more leading practices and from companies. Some of the areas that I can quickly mention where companies can take the opportunity to improve would be to set and disclose more process-oriented targets, To drive impact, implement integrated approaches. There was a question around how freshwater ecosystems could be tied. So whenever you are doing assessments, try to look at integrated approaches that can help you achieve multiple benefits. Scope of targets should include material parts of the value chain. So something notable that I just touched upon was also like we saw a lot of companies having water positive, water balance, replenishment, restoration commitments, and we are keen to see how these type of targets play out more with new guidance coming out, including the water quality benefits accounting guide, continuing work to define the science-based targets for fresh water, the work of water aid wash for work. In short, we need to see the ambition of corporate water stewardship efforts to match the scope and scale of the problem.
Thank you very much, Shama. That's been really interesting. Let's hope for a rising tide of investor engagement and a flood of corporate action in this area. I thank everyone who has been on our webinar. If you have any questions for either myself or Shama, please do reach out to us via email. We'd be happy to discuss further. And with that, we'll say thank you very much for attending and have a good rest of your day.